The air in New Mexico in July is warm even after dark. It holds the heat of the day in a particular way, not heavy, not pressing, but present, like something that has decided to stay. On the night of July 23, 1995, in the driveway of a house in Cloudcroft, an amateur astronomer named Alan Hale had set up his telescope and angled it toward a region of the southern sky where the globular cluster M70 sits in a dense spherical arrangement of ancient stars. He had observed M70 before. He knew what it was supposed to look like through an eyepiece, a faintly resolved cloud of light, compact and familiar, a fixed point in the standard catalog of known objects. What he found instead was something he did not immediately recognize. A soft, diffuse smudge of light sat near M70's position. It was not M70. It was not cataloged among the objects he expected to find in that region of the sky. It was simply there, faint and slightly blurred at its edges, an unfamiliar brightness in a place he had looked before, without incident. Hale observed it for some time. He checked his charts. He consulted his notes. The object did not behave like a nearby satellite or a passing aircraft. It held its position with the patient steadiness of something very far away, moving only as the sky itself moved, following the slow rotation of the night above the high desert of southern New Mexico. In the same way, everything else moved, indifferent to observation, indifferent to recognition, simply present in the circle of the eyepiece, while the warm July air settled around the driveway and the house stood dark behind him. He did not know, in those first minutes, what he was looking at. That particular condition, the moment of not yet knowing, would not last long, but it lasted long enough to be worth pausing over the specific quality of that first encounter, the unnamed object sitting in the eyepiece of a driveway telescope in the quiet of a New Mexico July night, waiting to be found by someone who had simply been paying attention. Hale sent a report to the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams before the night was out. The Bureau served as the official clearinghouse for newly discovered astronomical objects, a postal address, and by the mid-1990s, an email address, where astronomers and dedicated amateurs could submit their observations and have them formally received, logged, and reviewed. His report described the object's position, its apparent brightness, its diffuse, non-stellar character, the qualities that distinguished it from the stars around it and made it something worth reporting. He filed the report in the early hours of the morning. The sky was still dark over the New Mexico desert when he sent it. Several hundred miles southwest, in the scrubland desert outside Stanfield, Arizona, a group of astronomy enthusiasts had gathered for what is commonly called a star party, an informal gathering of observers who travel away from city light to spend a night looking at the sky through their own and each other's instruments. The desert around Stanfield offered the particular darkness that astronomers require. No competing glow on the horizon, no street lamps, no illuminated signage, only the faint, warm edge of a small town at a distance, and then the flat scrubland stretching away in every direction under a sky dense with stars. Thomas Bopp was among the group that night. He was not looking through his own telescope. He was sharing a friend's instrument, a common arrangement at star parties, where the equipment present tends to belong to a small number of dedicated observers, and the rest participate by turns at the eyepiece. At some point during that night, Bopp looked through his friend's telescope at the same region of sky Hale had examined from his driveway in New Mexico. The same diffuse, unnamed object appeared in the eyepiece. He observed it carefully. He made the same determination Hale had made, independently and at nearly the same hour, under a different patch of desert sky, he submitted his own report to the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams. The Bureau received two separate accounts of the same object, filed on the same night, from two observers who had never been in contact with each other, working from opposite ends of a landscape of desert and mountain and dry summer air. The object was given both their names. It became Comet Hale-Bopp, a designation that would, over the next 2 years, become one of the most widely recognized proper nouns in American public life. Printed in newspaper headlines, spoken on evening news broadcasts, and looked at by an unusually large portion of the planet's population who happened to live beneath the right portion of sky in the right window of time. But none of that had happened yet on the night of July 23rd, 1995. On that night, there were only 2 reports sent before dawn, and an object still unnamed, moving outward from an encounter with the inner solar system that had begun long before any human eye had turned in its direction. The printed form at the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams, or the email equivalent, that had by 1995 begun to supplement the Bureau's older postal processes, would have carried each report in standard observational format, the object's position in right ascension and declination, the estimated magnitude, the morphological notes that distinguished it as a comet rather than a galaxy or a faint asteroid. 2 separate incoming reports, the same night's date on both, the coordinates listing the same region of sky in the precise, unhurried numerical notation of professional astronomical correspondence, the language of measurement that carries no drama and requires none, only accuracy, only the careful transcription of what was seen and when and where. The comet Hale-Bopp had independently observed that July night was not a new object in the sense that it had recently come into being. It was an ancient body, a remnant of the solar system's formation, composed of ice and rock and dust, compacted into a nucleus of unusual size. That size would become one of the most discussed facts about it in the scientific literature of the following 2 years. Hale-Bopp's nucleus was estimated at approximately 60 kilometers in diameter. To put that figure in the context of other comets, Halley's Comet, among the most famous periodic comets in recorded history, has a nucleus estimated at roughly 15 kilometers in its longest dimension. Hale-Bopp's nucleus was 2 to 3 times larger than Halley's in diameter, and the volume difference implied by that ratio is substantially greater still. Among all cometary nuclei that have been estimated with any reliability, Hale-Bopp ranked among the largest known, an anomaly within a category of objects that already tend toward the extremes of unfamiliarity. The consequence of that size was direct and observable. A larger nucleus means more surface area from which volatile materials, water, ice, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and various other compounds can sublimate as the comet approaches the sun and solar radiation warms its frozen surface. More sublimation means more gas and dust released into space, forming the coma, the diffuse glowing envelope surrounding the nucleus, and eventually the tails that stream away from the nucleus under the influence of solar wind and radiation pressure. A larger nucleus, in short, produces a more spectacular comet, all other things being equal, and in Hale-Bopp's case, all other things were more or less favorable. The comet was on a trajectory that would bring it reasonably close to the inner solar system, close enough for significant solar heating, and it was producing gas and dust at a rate that made it detectable at an unusually large distance from the sun, even before that approach had fully developed. When Hale-Bopp first observed it in July 1995, the comet was still very far from the sun, roughly the distance of Jupiter's orbit. Most comets are not detectable at that distance. The gas output required to produce a visible coma simply doesn't develop that far out, where solar radiation is comparatively weak. Hale-Bopp was producing enough gas, driven by its enormous nucleus, to be visible at 7 astronomical units from the Sun, a detail that professional astronomers recognized immediately as an indicator of unusual potential. If the comet was already this active this far out, its eventual brightness closer to the Sun could be extraordinary. The predictions were cautious, as they generally are when comets are concerned. Comets are famously difficult to predict. The history of cometary observation includes several celebrated cases in which a comet that appeared to offer spectacular possibilities arrived at perihelion, its closest approach to the Sun, in a dismal, underwhelming way. The ice and gas not quite cooperating with the expectations built around them. Scientists and science writers in 1995 and 1996 were careful to note this history when discussing Hale-Bopp. The comet might exceed expectations. It might also disappoint. Both outcomes had precedent. It exceeded them. At its peak brightness in April 1997, Hale-Bopp reached a visual magnitude of approximately -1.4. Magnitude in astronomy is measured on a scale that runs counterintuitively. Lower numbers indicate greater brightness, and negative numbers indicate objects brighter still than the baseline. Magnitude, -1.4 places Hale-Bopp among the brightest objects in the night sky, at its peak, comfortably visible to the naked eye, not just from dark sites, but from cities, from suburban streets, from any location where the sky above was reasonably clear. That quality, the ability to be seen without any equipment, without any planning, without any particular knowledge of where to look, made it something different from most comets, which reward dedicated observers at dark sites and remain essentially invisible to the casual eye. Hale-Bopp was visible for roughly 18 months in the course of its approach and departure. The sustained visibility was itself unusual. Most bright comets are spectacular for a much shorter period, reaching peak brightness quickly and then fading as they move away from the Sun's influence and their gas output diminishes. Hale-Bopp's enormous nucleus meant that it continued producing gas and dust at significant rates for an extended period on either side of perihelion, stretching the window of visibility far beyond what most comets offer. For most of 1996 and the first half of 1997, anyone who chose to look in the right direction on a clear night would find it there, not requiring dark skies, not requiring binoculars, simply visible, a bright and slightly blurred point of light that resolved into something more complex for those who looked more carefully. The people who looked more carefully saw the tails. Hale-Bopp displayed 2 primary tails that were distinctly visible in photographs and under good conditions to the naked eye. The first was the ion tail, a stream of charged gas particles, ionized by solar radiation, and then swept back from the nucleus, almost directly away from the Sun, by the solar wind. In photographs, the ion tail appeared as a narrow, vivid blue-white stream, straighter than the other tail, pointing with something close to precision in the direction directly opposite the Sun's position. The color came from the specific emission wavelengths of ionized molecules, particularly carbon monoxide, fluorescing as they streamed away from the comet's coma into the void behind it. The second tail was the dust tail, broader, more curved, composed of solid particles of dust released from the nucleus as the ice sublimated, and then pushed back by radiation pressure at a rate slightly slower than the gas, causing it to curve away from the ion tail in a wide arc. In photographs, the dust tail appeared as a broader, warmer toned stream, pale yellow-white against the dark sky, reflecting sunlight off the surfaces of countless individual dust particles, following their own slightly modified orbital paths behind the comet's nucleus. The curvature of the dust tail traces the comet's own trajectory. The particles at its outermost extent represent dust released at earlier points in the approach. The geometry of the two tails together creating a kind of visual record of the comet's recent passage through space. Astronomers documented a third tail during Hale-Bopp's approach, a sodium tail, detected through the specific emission lines produced by neutral sodium atoms streaming away from the nucleus region. Sodium tails are rare. The documentation of one in Hale-Bopp made it only the second comet in recorded history confirmed to display this phenomenon. The sodium tail was not visible in ordinary photographs and was not detectable by the naked eye. Its identification required filtered imaging and careful spectroscopic analysis, but it was present, and its presence added a layer of unusual detail to an object already exceptional in its other characteristics. A reminder that what the naked eye observes from a suburban street on an April night in 1997 represents only a fraction of what is actually occurring in the chemistry of a comet's approach. Photographs of Hale-Bopp at peak brightness, wide-field images taken from dark sites during the weeks around perihelion, show the dual tails fanning away from the bright nucleus in their distinct directions, the blue-white of the Eon tail extending to the left or right, depending on orientation, the warmer, broader dust tail arcing away in its characteristic curve. Printed large, the color difference between the two is clearly visible. The nucleus itself appears as a point of overexposed brightness at the convergence point of the two streams, too bright for the long exposures required to capture the tail's full extent, so that the comet, in such images, seems to emanate from a blaze of light, rather than from any object of definable surface or boundary. Those images circulated widely during the spring of 1997. They appeared in newspapers and science magazines, and on the websites that were by that year beginning to carry photographs in their current, instantly accessible form. They were printed in large format and displayed in museum lobbies and planetarium foyers. They were reproduced in the kind of popular science publications that place an extraordinary photograph on a cover and allow the image itself to be the argument for looking. For a period of months in early 1997, Hale-Bopp was something that a substantial portion of the American and European public had either seen directly with their own eyes or seen in reproduction, a shared object in the ordinary sky that required nothing to observe except the willingness to look up. The observatory logbooks and professional observational records from this period reflect a community of astronomers working through an unusual abundance of data. An entry dated April 1997, recording the comet's magnitude at -1.4, carries nothing beyond what any such record would carry: a date, a measurement, a notation of observing conditions, the steady and careful handwriting of someone trained to record what they see without embellishment. The page slightly worn at its corner from repeated reference, the way professional astronomical records tend to wear when they contain something worth returning to. The measurement itself is the event. The number is what the comet was, reduced to its essential observable quality by the standardized language of photometric measurement, legible to any astronomer in any country, carrying no interpretation beyond its own precision. Hale-Bopp reached perihelion, its closest approach to the Sun, in April 1997, at a distance of approximately 0.914 astronomical units from the Sun, placing it slightly inside Earth's own orbital distance. After perihelion, It began its long outward journey. The brightness faded gradually as the distance from the sun increased and the rate of gas production declined with the reduction in solar heating. By mid-1997, it was fading. By late 1997, it had retreated to the kind of distance at which only dedicated large aperture instruments could follow it. By the early 2000s, it had moved beyond the reach of most professional instruments engaged in anything other than specifically dedicated follow-up observation. It continued outward, unobserved by anything except the mathematics of orbital mechanics, following the path that its velocity and the gravitational influences it had encountered would carry it along for the next several centuries. Those gravitational influences had, during Hale-Bopp's 1997 approach, included a significant encounter with Jupiter. The giant planet's gravity had exerted a measurable effect on the comet's trajectory, subtly altering the ellipse it followed around the sun. Before that encounter, Hale-Bopp had been following an orbit that would have returned it to the inner solar system in approximately 4,200 years, already a span of time so large as to be effectively unimaginable in terms of human history, but a figure that orbital mechanics could nevertheless calculate with reasonable confidence from the available positional data. After the gravitational nudge from Jupiter, the numbers changed. The future orbital period, recalculated to account for the trajectory alteration, came out at approximately 2,520 years. The comet's return had been moved forward by roughly 1,680 years, a change that sounds significant when stated that way, but which amounts across the actual scale involved to a modest adjustment in an already incomprehensibly long arc of time. Hale-Bopp will not return to the inner solar system for more than 2 millennia. The civilization that observes its return will bear no meaningful relationship to the one that watched it pass in 1997, will not speak the same languages or live in the same political configurations or understand the sky through the same instruments or the same concepts. The mathematics that calculate its return will, in some form, still apply. The orbit doesn't care about any of that. The revised orbital period also produced a slightly altered aphelion, the point of the comet's farthest distance from the sun, at the far end of its elliptical path. Working outward from the 520-year period and the perihelion distance and velocity measurements taken during the 1997 approach, astronomers could calculate the general region of space Hale-Bopp would reach at aphelion, far beyond the orbit of Neptune, deep into the outer solar system, in the region where the solar wind's influence becomes negligible and the interstellar medium begins, in the cold and dark and quiet that exists between planetary distances and stellar ones, a region which has no name that anyone uses in ordinary speech, because nothing about ordinary speech was designed to address it. From that aphelion, which it will reach sometime in the middle of the second millennium of the Common Era, the comet will begin to fall back inward. The fall will take approximately the same length of time as the outward journey. The mathematics are symmetrical, the orbit an ellipse rather than a parabola, meaning the comet remains gravitationally bound to the sun and will, eventually, in whatever form it retains after centuries of slow sublimation in the cold of the outer solar system, return to the region of space where it was first identified by 2 observers on separate patches of desert in July of 1995. There is something in that particular image worth resting in before it passes, the comet that Hale watched through his driveway telescope in the warm night air of New Mexico, the same object that Bopp observed through a friend's instrument at a star party in the Arizona scrubland that produced the 2 separately filed reports at the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams before a single July night was out. That object has already moved far beyond the reach of any ground-based telescope currently in operation. It continues outward, right now at whatever moment this narration is encountered, following the revised ellipse that Jupiter's gravity and Hale-Bopp's own velocity describe in the mathematics of its measured trajectory. The comet does not recede from a human perspective. It simply continues on the path it has always followed, the one that brought it close to the sun, and therefore close to the instruments and eyes that could observe it, and that now carries it back outward through the same graduated distances it descended on the way in, past Jupiter's orbital zone, past Saturn's, past the distant reaches where Uranus and Neptune describe their long, slow paths, and then beyond those, into the outer solar system's edge, into the region of comets and cold rock and quiet that exists at the limit of the sun's direct gravitational domain. The two tails that photographers captured in those wide-field images from April 1997, the blue-white ion tail and the warmer curved dust tail, have long since dissipated. They were not permanent features of the comet, but temporary ones, produced only by the conditions of proximity to the sun, which energized the surface and drove the outgassing that created them. In the cold of the outer solar system, there is no such energy. The nucleus cools, the sublimation slows, and then effectively stops. The coma disperses, the tails no longer form. What remains is the nucleus, 60 kilometers of ancient ice and rock and dust, quiet now, dark, following the ellipse without illumination or drama through a region of space where nothing nearby has ever been named. That nucleus will, in 2,520 years, begin its return. The sun will slowly warm it again as it descends through the planetary distances. The sublimation will resume. The coma will reform. The tails will reappear, or something like them, modified by whatever mass the comet retains after 2.5 millennia of slow erosion. By the time it reaches the inner solar system again, whatever civilization exists to observe it will not know to call it Hale-Bopp. The name was given by the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams on the morning of July 24, 1995, to the object described in two separately submitted reports, each bearing the same night's date, each carrying the precise coordinates of the same diffuse smudge of light sitting near M70 in a July sky over the American Southwest. The name will not survive the next 2,520 years in any form that connects it to whatever it will be called by whoever is watching when the comet comes again. The orbit doesn't carry the name. It carries the mathematics, the velocity, and the mass and the gravitational relationships that were measured in 1997 and that will continue to govern the path regardless of what language is used to describe them, regardless of whether any language continues to exist in which they could be described at all. The orbit simply continues. The comet follows it. The distance between Hale-Bopp and the sun increases by some measurable amount every second, indifferently, without urgency, in the same way it will tomorrow, and in the same way it was increasing before either Hale or Bopp looked in its direction on the night of July 23, 1995, and in the same way it will continue increasing for the next several centuries before the long, slow return begins. The warm July air over Cloudcroft in New Mexico, the flat, dark scrubland around Stanfield in Arizona, the two eyepieces angled toward the same region of sky, the two unfiled reports that were not yet reports, only the careful attention of two observers who noticed something that should not have been there, and then, in the unhurried and precise language that the field requires, described what they saw and sent the descriptions before dawn. All of that belongs to the record now. The record holds the coordinates, the magnitude, the morphological notes, the date, the names, everything the record can hold. It holds. What it cannot hold is the quality of that first moment. The warm air, the narrow eyepiece circle, the unnamed smudge where only the familiar stars of M70 should have been, the specific texture of not yet knowing what something is before it has been named, before it has been measured, before it has been given an orbital period, or a nucleus diameter, or a peak magnitude, or a perihelion date, when it is still only a diffuse brightness in the eyepiece of a driveway telescope on a July night, slightly out of place in a sky that was supposed to be entirely known. That moment passed quickly, as such moments do. The reports were filed, the object was named, the measurements accumulated. The orbit was calculated, and then revised, and then settled into the figure that the records now carry. 2,520 years before the comet's return to the inner solar system, a number expressed in the same precise, unhurried notation as the coordinates first filed before the summer dawn of 1995. The comet moves outward now. It has been moving outward since perihelion. It will be moving outward for a very long time. The path it follows is already known, already plotted, the numbers already on record, the future already described in the mathematics of measured velocity and mass and gravitational influence. The comet carries none of that with it. It carries only the ellipse, the ice, the ancient rock, the quiet dark of the outer solar system drawing gradually closer, and somewhere in the middle of the third millennium, at a distance from the sun that no human instrument has ever reached, and almost certainly none will, it will slow and pause and begin, without drama, without any observer present, to note the moment, to fall back inward toward the light. A hospital corridor in Houston, Texas, in 1972, carries a specific quality of light that has nothing to do with the time of day. The fluorescent tubes overhead produce an illumination that is neither warm nor cold, but simply complete, a steady, sourceless brightness that falls across linoleum floors and painted cinder block walls without shadow. The smell of such a corridor, antiseptic and faintly metallic, the particular institutional cleanliness of a building that never entirely sleeps, is one that the body registers before the mind does, a signal that ordinary life has been briefly interrupted, and that ordinary rules about time and schedule have been set aside. Marshall Applewhite arrived in that light as a patient. He was 41 years old. He had been, until recently, a music professor, a choir director, a man whose life had been organized around rehearsal schedules and semester calendars and the disciplined repetition of scored notation, and now he was in a hospital in Houston in the middle of his life, in a corridor that belonged to no particular hour of any particular day. The nurse who moved through that corridor was named Bonnie Lou Trosdale Nettles. She was 38 years old. She was a registered nurse, trained and practiced, a person whose professional life had long been organized around the close, patient attention to other people in moments of difficulty. Nothing about the specific encounter between them that year has been recorded in the kind of detail that would allow its exact texture to be recovered. What the record confirms is that they met, that they spoke, and that whatever passed between them in that institutional fluorescent light became, within a short time, the foundation of an intellectual and personal bond that neither of them had apparently anticipated, and from which neither of them turned back. Both would later describe the meeting as fated. That word fated would carry a different weight for them than it might carry for most people who use it to mean fortunate, or well-timed, or simply surprising. For Applewhite and Nettles, fated would come to mean something closer to cosmically scheduled, arranged in advance by forces operating at a scale well beyond the merely human, and their first encounter in that Houston corridor would be folded, in time, into a much larger story about who they were and why they had appeared in this particular world at this particular moment. But in 1972, in the hospital, that story had not yet been written. They were two people who had met by ordinary circumstance in an ordinary building, and something in that meeting held. Marshall Herff Applewhite had grown up the son of a Presbyterian minister in Texas, a background that had given him an early familiarity with the cadences of sermon and scripture and the particular community that forms around shared religious conviction. He had gone on to earn a master's degree in music from the University of Colorado, and the discipline and structure of formal musical training had shaped his manner throughout his adult life. He had held a faculty position at St. Thomas University in Houston as a music professor and choir director, a role that placed him at the center of a structured community of students and performers, a conductor whose authority was expressed through the shaping of collective sound toward a shared purpose. That position and the professional life it represented had come apart in the years just before the hospital. The exact circumstances involved personal crisis and professional difficulty, and the teaching position was lost. The structure that had organized his days, the rehearsal schedules, the institutional rhythms, the shared project of music, was no longer there. He arrived at the hospital at the end of that unraveling. Bonnie Nettles had built her adult life in a different direction. The nursing training and the professional practice formed one layer of it, the steady, competent, visible work. But Nettles had long maintained a set of interests that ran alongside the clinical. She had been drawn to theosophy, the philosophical movement founded in the 19th century by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, which proposed that beneath the visible surface of ordinary religion and ordinary science, there existed a hidden architecture of spiritual reality, a hierarchy of advanced beings, Mahatmas, masters, adepts who had graduated beyond the limitations of ordinary human existence and who periodically communicated with the human world to assist its evolution. Theosophy was a large and complicated body of thought, drawing on Hindu and Buddhist metaphysics, as well as Western esoteric traditions, and it had produced, across the decades since Blavatsky's foundational texts appeared in the 1870s and 1880s, a substantial community of readers and practitioners in the English-speaking world. Nettles was among them. She had also maintained interests in astrology and in what was then called channeling, the practice of receiving communications from non-physical intelligences, and had been involved in a small metaphysical study group in Houston in the period before she met Applewhite. The study group met in the way such groups do, a circle of chairs in a rented or borrowed room, a handful of attendees who shared an interest in the edges of what official knowledge acknowledged, an open book on someone's knee, conversation that moved between documented esoteric texts and personal spiritual experience without a sharp line between them. Nettles participated in that world with the same practical seriousness she brought to her nursing work. The bond that formed between Applewhite and Nettles after the hospital meeting was by any accounting unusual in its speed and intensity. Within a short period, they had established a partnership that was neither conventionally romantic nor conventionally professional, but something that seemed to require a different category entirely, a shared intellectual and spiritual project that quickly became the primary organizing principle of both their lives. Both left behind the existing structures of their lives. Nettles had a family, a marriage, children. Applewhite had the remnants of an academic career and a network of professional relationships. The departure from those structures was not clean or without consequence for the people around them. But for Applewhite and Nettles, the pull of what they were developing together apparently outweighed the difficulty of what they were leaving. They began to talk and read and think together. They drew on Nettles' existing knowledge of theosophy and channeled communications, and on Applewhite's deep familiarity with Christian scripture and the structures of Christian theology. They read widely across the available literature of the early 1970s, spiritual underground, a world that included not only the explicitly religious, but also the rapidly expanding genre of UFO literature, which in that decade was producing detailed accounts of contactees and abductees and extraterrestrial visitors, whose relationship to the spiritual beings of traditional religion was being actively explored by a growing number of writers and readers. The boundary between the theological and the extraterrestrial was, in that world, not a boundary at all. The documents that would later define Heaven's Gate's theology draw clearly on both traditions, and the synthesis Applewhite and Nettles built in these early years was assembled from materials that were already in circulation, already available to anyone who knew where to look. What set their synthesis apart was not the individual elements, but the specific architecture they constructed from them, and the conviction, which became, over time, absolute and unwavering, that they were not merely students of this material, but participants in it. That conviction began to take shape in these early years. It would develop and elaborate over the following decades. But the seed of it, the belief that their meeting had been arranged, that their shared project had a purpose that extended beyond the merely personal, that they had a specific role to play in a story much larger than either of their individual lives, appears to have been present from very early on. By the mid-1970s, Applewhite and Nettles had developed their ideas far enough to begin sharing them with others in a more organized way. They gave their project a name, HIAM, standing for Human Individual Metamorphosis. The name was chosen deliberately. Metamorphosis was not a casual or decorative word for them. It was a precise description of the process they were proposing. The human being, in their emerging theology, was not a fixed and final form. The human being was a larval stage, a temporary configuration of consciousness in a biological container, and the possibility existed for those who undertook the necessary preparation and followed the necessary process of moving beyond that stage into something qualitatively different. The caterpillar did not simply improve. It dissolved and reconstituted. It became, in the most literal sense, something it had not been before. Applewhite and Nettles were offering a version of that transformation, framed in terms that drew on Christian scripture, theosophical metaphysics, and an increasingly detailed extraterrestrial cosmology. They traveled. In the early and mid-1970s, they moved through the western United States and Canada, living simply and spending their time developing their ideas and encountering people who were drawn to what they were describing. This was a period in American cultural life when the structures of organized religion were being questioned by a substantial portion of the population, when the counterculture of the 1960s had left behind it a large number of people who were genuinely seeking something, some coherent account of what existence was and what it was for, and who were open to frameworks that lay outside the mainstream. The world that Applewhite and Nettles were moving through was populated by these seekers, and in that world, a carefully developed alternative theology, delivered by two intelligent, earnest, serious-minded people, was not necessarily unusual, and was not without appeal. They went by names other than their own. Applewhite became Bo. Nettles became Peep. The names were informal markers, the kind of shorthand that might develop within any close community. But they also performed a function. They signaled a departure from ordinary personal identity. a stepping away from the biographical self and towards something that defined itself by its role rather than its history. Bo and Peep, a shepherd and a keeper of sheep. The pastoral imagery was not accidental. It placed them in a lineage of scriptural shepherding, of leading a flock toward a destination only the shepherd could see clearly, though they would eventually leave those particular names behind as the group's identity continued to evolve. The first significant public moment came in September 1975. Applewhite and Nettles had arranged a meeting in Waldport, Oregon, a small coastal town on the Pacific coast of the state, in a rented community hall. The hall was the kind of modest civic space that small towns maintain for meetings and gatherings, folding chairs that stacked against the wall when not in use, a small stage or platform at one end, windows that looked out onto a street that was quiet in the evening hours. A flyer had been circulated, a simple document, plain black text on white paper, the kind of thing that could be produced on a mimeograph machine and pinned to bulletin boards in health food stores and community centers and laundromats, the informal distribution network of a particular kind of 1970s alternative information. The flyer announced a meeting on the topic of UFOs and extraterrestrial reality and the possibility of a literal journey off the Earth. People came, curious local residents, people who had seen the flyer, people who had heard through word of mouth that something unusual was being offered in the community hall on a particular evening in September. They settled into the folding chairs and listened to Applewhite and Nettles, Bo and Peep, present what they had been developing in private for several years. The presentation was not tentative. It was organized and earnest and delivered with the conviction of people who believed absolutely in what they were saying. The core of the message was this, that an extraterrestrial level of existence was real and reachable, that the human body was a temporary vehicle and not the self, that the process of graduating to a higher level required specific preparation and commitment, and that Applewhite and Nettles were themselves beings from that higher level who had incarnated in human form specifically to offer this information and this opportunity to whoever was ready to receive it. What happened after the meeting in Waldport was unusual enough to attract the attention of journalists and wire services and eventually national newspapers. A significant number of the attendees, estimates varied but ran to several dozen people, did not return to their ordinary lives after the meeting. They left with Applewhite and Nettles. They walked out of the community hall in the Pacific Northwest autumn and into a journey that would take them away from their existing homes and families and employment and toward a communal life organized entirely around the theology Bo and Peep had presented. Some had families who were not with them that evening. Some had jobs, mortgages, ongoing obligations of the ordinary kind. They set these aside. The parking lot outside the community hall would have held their cars. The town would have been unchanged in every direction. The Pacific dark, and audible beyond the dunes, the Oregon night, cool and salt-scented, and some of these people, for reasons that made complete sense to them in ways that made no sense to the people they had left behind, chose not to go back to where they had come from. The national press coverage that followed was, by the standards of American media in 1975, substantial. Newspapers carried reports about the group. Parents of some who had joined began organizing, searching for their adult children, expressing alarm at a gathering of followers who had apparently abandoned their ordinary lives to follow two self-described representatives of an extraterrestrial civilization. The word cult began to appear in coverage, a word whose history and implications are complicated, but whose use in 1975 carried a clear emotional charge It meant, in the way the word was being used, something outside the range of the acceptable, a group organized around a submission of individual judgment that the ordinary culture regarded as dangerous. Applewhite and Nettles were named in these reports. Their backgrounds were investigated. The gap between Applewhite's former life as a music professor at a Jesuit university in Houston and his current existence as a wandering prophet of extraterrestrial salvation was noted. The coverage was skeptical and in places alarmed, and it functioned in the way such coverage often does, drawing more attention to the group's existence, ensuring that more people knew their message had been delivered without materially affecting the group's internal life or self-understanding. For Applewhite and Nettles, the press attention was not entirely unwelcome. They had held the Waldport meeting because they wanted to reach people who were ready to receive the information they had been developing. The coverage, however framed, extended the reach of that information. They continued to hold meetings, to travel, to develop the theology, to gather and sometimes lose members as the group moved through the late 1970s. Bonnie Nettles had adopted, alongside her informal name Peep, a formal teaching name within the group. Applewhite became Dew, a name that would be his for the rest of his life. The names drew on the musical scale: Do, Re, Mi, Ti, a reference to Applewhite's musical background that also carried a sense of systematic order, of notes in a progression, of a structure in which each element had its place. Within the group's own language and documents, Ti and Do were not simply names but designations of a specific cosmological role, two souls from the next level, incarnated together in human vehicles, working in partnership to carry out a mission of transmission. The group passed through several years of itinerant communal life, moving from place to place, living simply, developing the doctrinal materials that would eventually form the body of Heaven's Gate's published theology. Nettles, T, had been the partner who brought the metaphysical knowledge, the theosophical framework, the familiarity with channeled communication and esoteric literature, and her influence on the developing theology was substantial, visible in the specific texture of the ideas, even in the early documents. She died of cancer in 1985. Her death was a rupture in the group's structure that required a doctrinal response, and the response Applewhite developed was itself theologically significant. Tipondi had completed her mission in her human vehicle and returned to the next level. He taught and was now present there, available to communicate with Dew, but no longer in physical form among the membership. The group absorbed this and continued. Applewhite was now the sole living leader, and the responsibility of interpreting and transmitting the theology fell entirely to him. The group through the later 1980s and into the 1990s contracted and then stabilized, shedding members who left and occasionally adding new ones, maintaining a communal structure of strict shared standards that Applewhite had been elaborating since the mid-1970s. The name Heaven's Gate had come into use from the early 1990s onward, replacing the earlier designations et Aum, Total Overcomers Anonymous, as the group's primary public identity. The new name was both specific and wide. Heaven's Gate suggested a threshold, a physical entrance to a place that was real and located and reachable, a door that was currently standing at the far end of a journey that Applewhite was prepared to describe in exact doctrinal detail. The group had begun using the internet by the early 1990s, earlier than most organizations of any kind, and certainly earlier than most religious communities. Applewhite understood the internet as a new medium of transmission, a way of distributing their materials to anyone who encountered them, bypassing the editorial filters of mainstream publication and reaching a potentially large audience of people who were searching for something and might find, in Heaven's Gate's online presence, the specific something they had been looking for. The group built and maintained a website. They uploaded their doctrinal materials. They produced a series of videotape recordings, the Beyond Human series and others, in which Applewhite taught directly to a camera, explaining the theology in the patient, organized classroom instructor manner that had always characterized his communication, and these were made available for distribution. It is worth pausing on the particular quality of Applewhite's communication style as it appears in the surviving video recordings, because it is a specific and distinguishing feature of how the group presented itself to the world. He did not perform, he did not exhort or excite. He spoke with the considered, measured cadence of someone who had thought through what he was saying very carefully and who expected his audience to follow the argument step by step with the same care. He used a whiteboard or a flip chart. He drew diagrams. Periodically, he returned to the same points from different angles to ensure they were understood. The register was instructional, not evangelical, closer to a patient university seminar than to a revival meeting, and the effect of that register was to place the listener in the position of a student receiving a carefully organized presentation of documented facts, rather than a congregation being asked to feel something. This quality, the calm, organized instructional delivery, was present from the early public meetings through the final video statements Applewhite recorded before the group's departure. It was a quality that made the theology, however unusual its content, feel coherent on its own terms. Whether or not a listener accepted the framework itself was internally consistent, carefully elaborated, and delivered by someone who gave the impression of having tested each element of it against the others and found no contradictions that he had not already addressed. That quality of internal coherence was not incidental to the group's persistence and cohesion over more than 2 decades. It was central to it. By the time Comet Hale-Bopp appeared in the night sky over the American desert in 1995, Heaven's Gate had been an organized communal group for more than 20 years. The original public meeting in Waldport had been held in 1975. 20 years of shared doctrinal development, of communal living, of the slow accumulation of a shared language and a shared account of reality, of the progressive elaboration of a theology that had begun as a synthesis of theosophy and Christian scripture and extraterrestrial cosmology, and had grown across those decades into something with its own internal vocabulary, its own ritual structure, its own carefully defined hierarchy of spiritual progress, and its own detailed account of what existed beyond the human evolutionary level and how the soul might reach it. The group that encountered the comet in 1995 and 1996 was not a new group. It was a community with a 20-year history of shared life and shared meaning-making, and the comet arrived into that history not as an outside force that created something from nothing, but as an event that the existing framework was already, in important ways, prepared to receive. In Houston, in the fluorescent light of 1972, none of this had been written yet. A man who had been a music professor was in a hospital. A nurse who read theosophy and kept a small metaphysical study group was on duty. What the record shows is that they met, that they spoke, and that something in the meeting held in ways that the years which followed would make strange and particular and complete. The rest of it, the doctrine, the community, the communal houses, the videotapes, the website, the decades of elaborated theology about the next level and the human vehicle and the soul's long journey toward graduation, all of that came afterward, step by step, in the way that things develop, When two people who have met in the middle of their lives decide that what they are building together is more important than what they were building before. In September 1975, in Waldport, Oregon, the community hall would have emptied slowly. People who had sat for an evening in folding chairs listening to Bo and Peep would have risen and gathered their coats and moved toward the door back into the autumn night in the quiet coastal town. Some would have driven home. Some would have walked to cars parked along the street and sat for a moment before turning the key, thinking about what they had heard. And some, the ones the newspapers would write about in the following weeks, the ones whose families would call police stations and crisis lines looking for information, stepped out of the community hall and into a different direction entirely, one that led away from the parking lot and away from the town and away from the ordinary structures of the lives they had arrived from. The hall's doors would have closed behind them. The folding chairs would have been stacked against the walls. The town of Waldport would have been unchanged in every direction. The ocean beyond the dunes going on in the dark without reference to any of it. The Oregon sky wide and cold and indifferent above the rooftops, and the autumn night settling over everything, quiet and complete. A simply furnished room. A whiteboard at the front of it, white and slightly reflective under overhead light. On the surface of the board, drawn in black marker, a diagram, layered horizontal lines, each labeled in careful handwriting, each representing a different stage of existence, arranged one above the next, like floors of a building that extended, in this rendering, beyond anything a floor plan had ever been asked to hold. The room around the whiteboard was plain, folding chairs, a low shelf along one wall, no windows or windows covered. The quality of the light was institutional, flat, even, not quite warm, and it fell across the diagram without flattery, making the lines and labels look exactly like what they were, the work of someone who had thought very carefully about an architecture that could not be photographed, and had committed it to a surface so that others could follow the argument from the beginning. Marshall Applewhite stood beside this whiteboard. His manner, in the recordings that survive from these teaching sessions, was calm and direct. He was not performing certainty. The certainty was simply present, settled into his bearing, like a quality of the room itself, and he spoke from within it, the way a professor speaks from within a subject that has long since passed from study into something closer to residence. The diagram on the board was a map. It described in its plainly drawn horizontal layers the entire structure of a cosmos that Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles had developed across more than 2 decades of shared thought, a cosmology that arranged existence not in the familiar religious architecture of heaven above and earth below, but in a sequence of evolutionary levels, each one higher and more refined than the last, each one accessible in principle to any consciousness prepared to undertake the discipline the transition required. The system had its own vocabulary, its own internal logic, its own account of where the human species stood within the larger order, and its own explanation of what that standing meant for every person who came to understand the map correctly. The name of the level above the human was the next level. This was not a metaphor. That distinction mattered enormously to the people who had built the system, and it shaped every other element of what they believed. The next level in Heaven's Gate's theology was a physically real civilization. It existed in space. Its members occupied actual bodies, not spiritual or symbolic bodies, but material forms, though forms that had been perfected beyond anything the human biological template offered. Next-level beings did not reproduce. They did not experience hunger or sexual drive or the pull of family attachment. They had graduated beyond the mammalian condition that defined human life and in doing so had moved into a mode of existence that Heaven's Gate described as more refined, more durable, more genuinely alive than the kind of existence a human body permitted. These beings traveled in spacecraft. They operated across vast distances. They had, according to the theology Applewhite taught from the diagram on his whiteboard, seeded life on Earth in the beginning, and had returned periodically since then to tend to the project, to plant and water and assess and harvest what had grown. The word harvest was used deliberately. It appeared in Heaven's Gate materials with a specific doctrinal meaning, drawn from the agricultural language of the New Testament, which the group read as a record of previous next-level activity rather than as religious allegory. Harvest meant the collection of souls who had reached a sufficient stage of development to be transferred to the next level, souls who had done the interior work the transition required, who had chosen the path consciously, and who were prepared to leave the human level behind without regret and without looking back at what they were releasing. The human level was, in this cosmology, a temporary and preliminary stage. It was not contemptible, it was not without value, but it was, by the measure of what existed above it, incomplete, a larval condition. Applewhite sometimes said, using a word he returned to often enough, that it became one of the system's central images. The caterpillar in the chrysalis, the transition between forms, the period of suspension and interior transformation through which a creature that had not yet found its true shape moved toward the one it would eventually inhabit. On the whiteboard, the human level sat somewhere in the lower middle of the diagram. Above it, connected by an ascending line, was the next level. Below it were other gradations, other stages of existence, the theology acknowledged without dwelling on. The direction of movement that mattered was upward. The question the system spent considerable care answering was how that upward movement occurred. A page from the group's self-published book, How and When Heaven's Gate May Be Entered, recorded the answer in language that was methodical, precise, and notably free of the emotional register that most religious writing carries. The text was dense and plainly typeset, printed in a format that looked more like a doctrinal manual than a devotional text, and its language had the quality of something that had been revised and clarified over many years until every phrase said exactly what it was meant to say and nothing more. A copy of the book, its spine unbroken, its pages slightly yellowed from storage, but its text entirely legible, captured the group's thinking at a level of detail that no summary could convey, because what the theology required was not a summary, but a complete and internally consistent architecture. And How and When Heaven's Gate May Be Entered was the closest the group came to providing one. The book held, among many other things, the doctrine of the vehicle. The vehicle was the human body, or rather, the vehicle was the word Heaven's Gate, members used for the human body, and the choice of the word was not incidental. A vehicle is a means of transport. It carries something from one place to another. It is functional, useful within a limited context, and ultimately expendable once the journey it was designed to serve has been completed. Heaven's Gate's theology held that the soul, or in the group's preferred language, the mind, a word they used to describe something closer to individual consciousness or identity than to the emotional self, existed independently of the body it occupied. The mind had been deposited into a human vehicle at birth or at some point in the developmental process. It was using the vehicle. The vehicle was not the self. Members referred to their own bodies in this vocabulary throughout their daily lives. The body was the vehicle. The body's hungers and drives were the vehicle's programming, the process of spiritual development required learning to distinguish between the vehicle's inputs, everything the biological body experienced, wanted, feared, or preferred, and the mind's own inclinations, which could be cultivated separately from the body's noise if the member applied sufficient practice and attention. This distinction was not merely theoretical, it was practiced. It organized the daily structure of communal life inside the group in concrete and observable ways, and it produced a set of behavioral standards that members were expected to maintain consistently and to hold each other accountable for maintaining. The suppression of what Applewhite called human mammalian behaviors was not a distant aspiration. It was a present and daily discipline, a curriculum the group was actively working through, and its requirements touched nearly every dimension of ordinary existence. The mammalian behaviors the theology identified as obstacles to next-level development were specific. Sexuality was the one most often discussed, but the list extended considerably further. Romantic attachment, the pairing of one person with another in a bond that placed the other individual at the center of concern, was considered a form of misdirection, a redirection of loyalty away from the next level and toward a human-level relationship that could only persist at the human level. Family bonds carried the same weight. A member who remained emotionally anchored to parents, siblings, or children was, in the system's logic, a member whose center of gravity had not fully shifted toward the destination the theology described. Personal ambition was another form of the same problem, investment in outcomes that accrued to the individual within the human world, rather than in the process of detachment and refinement the next level transition required. Even the quieter pulls of personal preference, aesthetic taste, the attachment to particular comforts, the pleasure of being recognized as an individual with a specific history and set of qualities, were included in what the theology asked members to release. The self that the human level had built up over the course of a lifetime was not the mind. It was an accumulation, a layer of vehicle programming that had to be distinguished from the deeper identity the mind represented, and then set aside. The metamorphosis image was used to explain why this was not loss, but preparation. The caterpillar, entering the chrysalis, does not experience what happens inside as a pleasant process. The caterpillar's form dissolves. What it was, as a caterpillar, ceases to exist as a coherent structure. The materials of its body are broken down and reorganized into something that shares almost nothing with what it was before. The creature that emerges from the chrysalis is not an improved caterpillar. It is a different category of thing, a form that was implicit in the caterpillar all along, but could not become actual until the dissolution was complete. Applewhite returned to this image repeatedly in his teaching sessions, in the videotaped lectures, and in the materials the group produced for public distribution, because it carried an internal logic that made the demand legible. The dissolution was the condition of the transformation, and the release of the human identity was not an ending. It was the process by which the actual self became free to develop into something that the human level could not have produced by any other means. The chrysalis, in this framework, was the period of communal life within the group, the practices, the disciplines, the check partner system, the celibacy, the uniform appearance, the suppression of individual preference. These were not punishments. They were the conditions of metamorphosis. They were what the chrysalis looked like from the inside. A videotape cassette from the Beyond Human series, Applewhite's extended teaching program, recorded and distributed in the early 1990s for interested individuals to view privately or in small groups, sat on a shelf in the group's communal space, its label written in neat block letters, its case worn slightly at the corners from repeated handling. The Beyond Human series ran to multiple volumes, each one a recorded session in which Applewhite worked systematically through the theology in the same patient, methodical manner visible in the whiteboard sessions. The tapes were not produced at any broadcast quality standard. The camera was fixed, the backgrounds were plain. The production suggested a group making the materials it needed with the resources it had, because the materials themselves were what mattered, not the medium they arrived in. The series took its name from the central claim of the theology that the destination of genuine development was not a better version of the human, but an existence beyond the human category altogether, condition the human mind could aspire to and prepare for, but could not arrive at, without the kind of total restructuring the chrysalis image described. The Beyond Human series was the group's most sustained attempt to explain this claim from the beginning, in enough detail that a person encountering it for the first time could follow the argument across its full length without needing prior familiarity with the source materials Applewhite was drawing from. Those source materials were primarily the New Testament. An open copy of the New Testament lay on a plain table in another part of the group's communal space. Certain passages were marked in the margins, small notations in careful handwriting that translated the text into the vocabulary and framework of the next level theology. The book was well used. Its pages had been turned many times. The binding had softened slightly with handling. It was not a decorative object. It was a working document, referenced often enough that the physical object bore evidence of the frequency of that reference, and the notations in its margins recorded the results of years of interpretive work. The slow, careful translation of a text the group knew well into a reading the wider world had not arrived at. The doctrinal claim about the Bible was foundational. Heaven's Gate taught that the New Testament, read through the correct interpretive lens, was not a record of supernatural events in the familiar religious sense, but a record of actual events, events that had occurred, that had material causes, and that had been imperfectly understood and transmitted by the humans who witnessed them, because those humans lacked the conceptual vocabulary to describe what they were seeing accurately. The angelic beings who appeared throughout the text were members of the next level. The miraculous events were demonstrations of next-level technology, advanced beyond anything the first-century Mediterranean world had any framework for comprehending. The light that accompanied divine appearances, the vehicles of fire and cloud, the impossible movements through sealed rooms and across bodies of water, these were not metaphors or exaggerations. They were accurate descriptions of real phenomena that the witnesses reported as best they could in the language they had. Jesus was the most significant figure in the theology, and the group's account of Jesus was the most carefully developed element of the doctrinal system. The soul that had incarnated into the body of Jesus of Nazareth was Heaven's Gate taught, a next-level soul, a being from the level above the human who had been sent on a mission to Earth, who had taken on a human vehicle for the duration of that mission, and who had conducted his ministry as a demonstration of what next-level advancement looked and felt like within the human context. His teachings were not moral philosophy. They were instructional, a record of the disciplines and orientations required for next-level development, delivered to a human population by a being who had already completed that development in a previous cycle. The crucifixion was not the end of the story. The resurrection was not a metaphor. Jesus' return in a physical body after death, and his ascension from the Mount of Olives in the presence of witnesses who watched him rise and disappear into a cloud, were, in Heaven's Gate's reading, descriptions of a specific physical event. A next-level craft had been present. The soul and recovered body of the incarnated next-level being had been transferred into that craft. The witnesses who described the ascension had seen as accurately as they could a spacecraft completing a scheduled extraction. This reading of the ascension was the template for the transformation Heaven's Gate members understood themselves to be preparing for. The pattern had been established. It had been demonstrated, recorded in a text that had survived intact for 2,000 years. And it was available to anyone willing to set aside the theological overlay that centuries of religious interpretation had deposited on top of the original account and read what the words actually described. On the margin of the relevant passage, the two men in white garments in Acts, the cloud that received him out of their sight, a careful hand had written a small notation in pencil, a phrase that connected the ancient text to the present vocabulary of the group's theology, drawing a quiet line between the ascension account and the understanding of the vehicle. The craft, the next level soul, completing its mission in a human body and departing the human level through a transition that had been arranged in advance. The handwriting was steady, the notation was brief. The book sat on its plain table in a room where the overhead light was flat and even, and the room was quiet around it in the way that communal spaces become quiet when no one is moving through them, when the people who use them are occupied elsewhere, and the objects they have left behind settle into their own still patience. The theology's account of what came before Jesus was equally specific. The next level had been involved with life on earth since its beginning. The beings humans recorded as gods, as divine messengers, as angels and archangels, and heavenly hosts. These were next-level crew members, carrying out assigned tasks within a long-running project that unfolded across timescales no human lifetime could observe in full. The seeding of biological life on Earth had been a next-level operation. The development of the human template had been intentional and supervised. The periodic interventions recorded across every major religious tradition were not independent revelations emerging spontaneously from within the human world. They were planned and executed operations, moments in a sequence that had a beginning and was moving toward an end that the next level understood fully, even as the humans living through it experienced it as mystery. The presence of a competing force was also part of the system. Heaven's Gate taught that a class of beings, the group called Luciferians, fallen or departed next-level entities who had chosen to operate independently and to establish their own influence over the human world, had spent a very long time working to keep human consciousness attached to the human level, to make the mammalian condition appear satisfying and complete, to redirect the search for meaning toward pleasure, achievement, relationship, and institutional religion rather than toward the actual path of next-level development. The Luciferians were not metaphorical figures. They were, in the theology's account, physically real entities who used the human world systems, media, religion, politics, social convention, the entire architecture of what the group sometimes called the world system, to ensure that the majority of humans never encountered the genuine opportunity the next level periodically offered. This accounted in the theology for the fact that only a small number of people responded to the Heaven's Gate message. The Luciferians had done their work well, and the human world's gravitational pull toward comfort and continuity was, by this reasoning, not a natural human condition, but a managed one, a condition maintained deliberately to prevent the very attachment to the next level that genuine spiritual development required. The diagram on the whiteboard, with its layered horizontal lines, included a notational reference to the lower levels, to what lay below the human, to the influence that operated from that region and worked against the upward movement the theology described. Applewhite's marker lines were plain. The labels were direct. The diagram did not dramatize what it mapped. It simply made the structure visible in the same patient, methodical tone the Beyond Human tapes carried, in the same register as the marginal notations in the New Testament, and the dense, careful prose of how and when Heaven's Gate may be entered. The register of the theology was throughout notable for what it did not contain. There was no fire in it, no brimstone, no emphasis on sin, guilt, damnation, or the fear of punishment. The human condition was not presented as fallen or corrupt in the traditional religious sense. It was presented as preliminary, a stage that had its own integrity and its own appropriate duration, but that was not the final form consciousness was meant to inhabit. The invitation the theology extended was not toward a rescue from something terrible. It was toward an advancement into something more complete. The tone of the written materials, the recorded sessions, the marginal notations, and the whiteboard diagrams was, consistently, the tone of patient instruction. Here is the structure. Here is where you are within it. Here is the direction of movement and the nature of the discipline the movement requires. The choice is available. One particular doctrinal element returned across multiple formats and materials with enough regularity to mark it as central rather than peripheral. The belief that the soul occupied a series of incarnations over time, that the mind Applewhite described as the true self, had inhabited previous human vehicles before the current one, and would require multiple cycles of experience and development before it accumulated sufficient preparation for the next level transition, was foundational to how the group understood its own membership. Members were not understood to be randomly gathered individuals who had happened to encounter the Heaven's Gate message and found it persuasive. They were understood to be souls who had been in preparation for this opportunity across multiple lifetimes, who had been deposited in vehicles capable of receiving the message at this particular moment in the next level's long-running Earth project, and whose recognition of the theology as true was itself a sign that the necessary preparatory work had been done. This meant that the group's small size was not a problem. It was expected. The genuine candidates for next-level advancement in any given harvest were always few. The message, when the next level sent it, was never intended for the majority. It was intended for the souls who had been prepared, and those souls, upon encountering the message, would know it, not because of external persuasion, but because of an interior recognition that the theology was not new information, but a remembered truth arriving from outside the current vehicle's experience. A diagram in the doctrinal materials depicted this, the soul's progress across incarnations toward what the materials labeled as graduation. The lines were simple. The labeled stages were plainly named. The diagram had the same classroom quality as the whiteboard in the teaching room, the same patient confidence that what was being described was real and mappable and available to careful thought. The word graduation appeared throughout the materials with a specific weight. Graduation from the human level meant the permanent transfer of a prepared soul into a next-level body, aboard a next-level craft, beyond the reach of the Luciferian influence that kept the human world in its managed condition. Graduation was not death. It was a transition between levels of existence, the chrysalis opening, the metamorphosis complete, the vehicle left behind as any vehicle is left behind when the journey it was designed to serve has ended. The vehicle was not the self. The vehicle's end was not the self's end. The documents were careful on this point, precise in their language, attentive to the distinction that made the concept available without the emotional weight the word death would have introduced. How and when Heaven's Gate may be entered held all of this in its plainly typeset pages: the map of the levels, the doctrine of the vehicle, the reading of the New Testament in extraterrestrial terms, the role of Jesus as a previously graduated next-level soul on mission, the sequence of incarnations, the harvest, the chrysalis, the graduation, the craft waiting above the world's atmosphere for the souls who were ready to be transferred. The book was not a short document. It was the accumulated product of more than 2 decades of doctrinal development, refined and reorganized over time as the theology deepened and the language for describing it became more precise. Its spine was unbroken on the shelf where it sat, but its pages carried the evidence of use, slight wear at certain edges, the occasional mark that suggested attention had paused at a particular passage. The New Testament on the plain table was its counterpart, the source text on one side, the developed interpretation on the other, the two together constituting something the group understood to be a complete and coherent account of what existence was, what the human species was doing here, what had been happening on and around Earth for longer than recorded history, and what the present moment in the Next Levels project represented. Outside the room where the whiteboard stood, the world continued in its ordinary operation. The institutional light fell on the diagram's neat lines and labeled stages. The marker lines were dry by now, fixed to the board's surface, describing in their patient geometry a cosmology that had been the organizing framework of a community's existence for more than 2 decades. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms with whiteboards are quiet when the session has ended. The chairs were still. The overhead light was still. The diagram remained exactly as Applewhite's hand had drawn it. The horizontal layers, the labeled stages, the ascending direction of movement, and it was possible, in that quiet, to rest with the strangeness of what the diagram described. A universe organized in levels, a species at an intermediate stage of a long development, a path upward that was available to those prepared to take it, drawn in plain black marker on a white surface in a room from which the sound of teaching had faded and left only the structure it had produced. The New Testament closed gently on its table in the adjoining room. The pencil notation in the margin of the Ascension passage was still there, small, careful, the handwriting of a person who had found in an ancient text a confirmation of a framework that had taken years to build. The book came to rest with the soft sound of pages settling against one another. The room held it in its flat, even light. The notation said what it said, connecting 2 vocabularies across 2 millennia, and then the room was quiet around it, and the quiet had the quality of something that had been attended to thoroughly and completely, without urgency, without alarm, the quality of a system fully thought through and left in place, waiting, in the patient manner of all well-built things, for the occasion that would make its purpose real. Chuck Schremick's photograph began as a sheet of plain photographic paper. The image was printed at home in the ordinary way of amateur astronomers who developed their own work in 1996, the comet's nucleus, a bright smear at center, the surrounding field of stars, rendered in varying degrees of softness, depending on how long each point of light had pressed itself onto the exposure during the time the shutter was open. The photograph was unremarkable by the standards of the thousands of images Hale-Bopp generated that season. Amateur equipment had captured the comet from backyards and rooftops across the country since the object became bright enough to photograph without professional instruments, and most of those images looked much like this one, a bright central blur, a trail of stellar background, the familiar scattered field of deep sky objects that the comet moved slowly across each night as it descended toward its closest approach. What Schremek noticed was the object beside it, slightly fuzzy, softly luminous, positioned in the field in a way that did not correspond to anything on the star chart he consulted. The chart was outdated, not by much, but enough. The star SO141894, a catalogued and entirely ordinary stellar object, whose coordinates placed it precisely in the region of sky the photograph captured, had not been included in the edition Schremek referenced that November. The soft, slightly blurred point of light sitting alongside Hale-Bopp's nucleus had a perfectly accurate astronomical identity. The chart that should have named it did not, and in the space left by that omission, the image became something other than what it was. Schremek described what he had photographed as a Saturn-like companion object. The language was his own, and it carried a specific weight, Saturn-like suggesting not just size, but structure, a body with discernible features, a shape distinct from a star. He circulated the image through the online forums and discussion groups that had become the informal infrastructure of amateur astronomy by the mid-1990s, and the claim moved quickly through those networks in the way that genuinely unusual astronomical observations always did before the verification had arrived to accompany it. Professional astronomers identified SAO1 41894 within a short period. The explanation was unambiguous. The object in the photograph was a known star, catalogued and documented, and the appearance of extension or fuzziness in the image was a photographic artifact produced by the equipment and the duration of the exposure. The companion was not a companion. The photograph showed a comet and a star, and the star had a name, and the name had been in the catalog since well before the night the photograph was taken. The explanation was clear. It was consistent with the available evidence, and it was offered by people with the relevant instruments and training to make the determination. The claim did not resolve. The explanation circulated alongside the original image, but the two did not cancel each other out in the forums and networks where the photograph was traveling. The gap between the claim and its correction was a few days wide, and in that gap, the image had already reached an audience large enough that the correction could not reliably follow every copy. The photograph was out. The name SAO 141894 was not always attached to it. Art Bell's program broadcast from the Nevada desert town of Pahrump. The studio was modest, a single desk, a microphone, the equipment that connected Bell's voice to a transmitter capable of reaching radio receivers across most of the continental United States in the small hours of the night. Coast to Coast AM had built its audience through the late 1980s and early 1990s on a format that was distinctive in American radio for its willingness to extend the same unhurried attention to anomalous claims that daytime programs gave to sports, weather, and traffic. Bell was not a credulous host in the simple sense. He asked questions, he pushed back on certain details, he occasionally expressed skepticism. But the architecture of the program, the late hour, the long-form conversation, the invitation to callers to contribute their own accounts, created an environment in which unresolved questions were the natural currency, and in which the suspension of judgment was experienced as a form of respect. Schremek appeared on Coast to Coast AM in November 1996. Bell introduced the companion claim to his audience of hundreds of thousands of listeners, framing it as an open and unresolved question rather than a settled misidentification. The photograph that had begun its circulation in amateur astronomy forums now entered a much larger stream. The size of Bell's audience at that hour was itself significant. The program reached people who were awake in the middle of the night, alone or nearly alone, in the particular receptive state that the small hours produce, and the subject matter of the conversation matched the hour in a way that daytime programming rarely could. A possible artificial object accompanying the most dramatic comet in a generation traveling toward Earth, captured in a photograph by an amateur in his home. The explanation was available. The question felt, to many listeners, still open. The radio broadcast preceded the internet's full emergence as the primary infrastructure for this kind of conversation, but only just. The web was becoming usable for large numbers of people in late 1996, not the web of later years, not the web of reliable search and instant cross-reference, but a web of static pages, email lists, and discussion forums where information moved in bursts and verification was entirely the reader's responsibility. The Hale-Bopp companion story found this infrastructure perfectly suited to it. Pages appeared, images were posted, transcripts of Bell's broadcast circulated. The claim did not need to be true to generate material, and the material did not need to be sourced to find an audience. The companion object existed, at that moment, as a genuine unresolved question for a significant number of people, because the space in which it might have been resolved, the reliable cross-reference, the immediate expert response, the searchable astronomical database, was not yet consistently available to the ordinary reader. The story reached Courtney Brown through the same channels. Brown was a political science professor at Emory University in Atlanta, a post he held alongside his direction of the Farsight Institute, an organization he had founded to pursue and document remote viewing as a systematic practice. Remote viewing had a specific documented history in the United States, connected to a program funded by the Defense Intelligence Agency across the 1970s and 1980s, a program whose declassified files described trained practitioners attempting to perceive remote locations through non-sensory means. That program had been terminated and declassified. Brown's Institute continued its own version of the practice independently outside the government context and published results through its own channels. Brown appeared on Coast to Coast AM in January 1997. The conversation that followed was extended and careful in the way that Bell's long-form interviews always were. Brown described his institute's remote viewing sessions targeting the Hale-Bopp companion. The results, he said, confirmed what Schrammek's photograph had suggested, that the object traveling alongside the comet was artificial, constructed, intentional. The sessions had found intelligence aboard it. The sessions had found purpose. The announcement Brown made on the program was specific enough to generate its own kind of anticipation. A credible astronomer, Brown said, had provided a photograph, a clear confirming image of the companion that would be released publicly in a matter of weeks. The photograph would settle the question. The astronomer's credentials would be attached to the image, and the combination of visual evidence and institutional authority would demonstrate what the remote viewers had already perceived. The audience that heard this announcement was large. The forums and pages that reproduced its details were numerous. The anticipation that built across the weeks between the announcement and the promised release was of a particular kind, not the anticipation of official confirmation, but a vindication of the kind of evidence that closes a question which official sources had been too quick to dismiss. The photograph, when it arrived, was a version of Schrammek's original image, reprocessed, altered in its presentation, but identifiably the same source material. The astronomer who had supposedly provided it was not identified, or was identified in a way that could not be verified, or declined to confirm the claim publicly. The image that was supposed to settle the question was the image the question had started from. Brown later said that the person who had provided the photograph had deceived him. Bell, on a subsequent broadcast, expressed his own dissatisfaction with how the story had resolved. The retraction reached a portion of the audience the original claim had reached, and that portion was not all of it. By the time the promised photograph failed to confirm anything beyond what was already known, the companion story had been in circulation for months. It had generated more material than any single retraction could address. It existed, for those who had followed it, as an unresolved question of a specific kind, not falsified in the strict sense, but disappointing, which is a different thing, and a difference that the original claim could survive in a way that falsification might not have permitted. The companion had not been proved. It had not been disproved. The explanation remained available, and for many listeners it remained unsatisfying, because explanations that arrive late and without the force of the original claim are always at a disadvantage. Heaven's Gate had been following the story. The group maintained an active internet presence from its early adoption of the web in the mid-1990s, when Applewhite recognized the medium as a vehicle for reaching an audience that could not be reached through community meetings or printed flyers in the way the group had operated in earlier decades. The website at Heaven's Gate was a specific kind of document, dense with text, navigable through a plain interface, holding the accumulated doctrinal materials the group had developed across more than 20 years of communal life and theological elaboration. The companion object story moved through the same internet infrastructure the group used to maintain its own presence, and the members who followed online discussions of UFOs and astronomical anomalies encountered it in the same spaces where they encountered discussions of their own beliefs and those of adjacent communities. Applewhite's interpretation of the companion story was not improvised. The claim that an artificial object was traveling alongside Hale-Bopp did not require him to revise his existing theology. It required him to recognize it. The group had understood for years that the next level operated spacecraft. The group had understood that the members' departure from their human vehicles would involve a physical transfer, a collection, an arrival that would take them out of the bodies they currently occupied and into the next stage of the existence they had been preparing for. What the companion story provided was not a new belief, but a specific event, a scheduled departure, a window, a comet whose path through the inner solar system marked the moment when the craft that had been sent for them would be in position to receive them. The comet's closest approach to Earth was scheduled for late March and early April of 1997. The companion, if it existed, would be closest then too. The timing was not incidental to the group's interpretation. It was the interpretation, the specific astronomical coordinate, that gave the existing theology its date. Applewhite described the comet's passage as the signal event of their mission in terms that were calm and unhurried, consistent with the register the group had maintained across all of its doctrinal communications. The comet was not a threat. The comet was a schedule. The statements the group posted to heavensgate.com in the months before March 1997 were written in the same plainly formatted text that carried all of the group's doctrinal material. The pages loaded on the browsers of that era as blocks of prose on a simple background, the URL visible in the navigation bar of whatever software the reader used, the text organized in the same careful, hierarchical fashion that Applewhite had always used in his teachings. The statements described the companion craft. They described the group's understanding of what the comet's passage meant. They described in language that was specific and deliberate. the anticipated departure from their human vehicles, and what was expected to follow. The pages were not hidden. They were indexed, accessible through the site's own navigation, and discoverable through the search tools available in early 1997. A person who found the site for any reason, curiosity about UFOs, interest in new religious movements, a search for information about Hale-Bopp, could read the departure statements alongside the theological documents that had accumulated across the previous 2 decades. The statements did not read as urgent or distressed. They read as announcements in the same register that someone might post a notice of relocation or a change of address, practical, informational, addressed to anyone who might want to know. The videotapes the group produced in the same period were a different kind of document. The tapes were not posted to the internet. The bandwidth of 1997 did not permit video distribution through the web in any practical sense. They were physical objects, recorded on cassettes, labeled in the neat handwriting the group used for all of its materials, and prepared for physical delivery. Rio D'Angelo had left the group before its final period and maintained a cordial relationship with its remaining members. The tapes were addressed to him. Other copies were addressed to media organizations, news outlets, television stations, the institutions that would, Applewhite anticipated, be the ones to explain what had happened to the public after it had happened. The tapes showed members speaking directly to the camera, individually and in small groups. Applewhite appeared in his own recording. The background was plain. The room was ordered. His hands, visible in the frame, were still. The statements he made were consistent with everything the group had written and published across its years of operation. The human vehicle as a temporary container, the next level as a physically real destination, the comet's passage as the scheduled moment of departure. The affect was calm. The pace was unhurried. There was nothing in the visual presentation that was unusual by the standards of the group's other recorded materials. The Beyond Human series and the teaching sessions that had documented Applewhite's instruction across the previous decade. What the farewell tapes added to the existing record was not new doctrine, but personal testimony, each member speaking from their own perspective about their experience in the group, their understanding of what was coming, and their willingness to proceed. The individual statements varied in their phrasing and their detail, as personal statements will, but they shared a register. The register was not grief. It was not fear. It was the particular calm of people who believed they understood what was happening, who had been preparing for a long time, and for whom the preparation had arrived at its conclusion. The packages were assembled in the quiet of the Rancho Santa Fe house. The cassettes in their plain cases, labeled in block letters with the same care the group brought to every practical task. The addresses written clearly. The packages set aside, complete, ready to be sent. The mailing did not happen immediately. The tapes were prepared in advance of the group's departure date, sitting in the house through the days and nights before the scheduled event, waiting in the way that prepared things wait. Outside the house on those evenings, the comet was visible. Hale-Bopp had reached its peak brightness and could be seen without any instrument from the Rancho Santa Fe neighborhood, its twin tails catching the light of the declining spring sun and reflecting it back across a sky that still carried the ambient light of the San Diego metro area. The neighbors who looked up would have seen it. The members of the group, for whom the comet was not simply a cometary object, but a navigational marker and a departure signal, would have seen it too, through the windows of the house, or from the courtyard, or from whatever vantage the evening offered. The comet and the house and the night around them were all simultaneous, all real, all present in the same California spring of 1997. the companion object that had prompted Schramek's claim and Bell's broadcast and Brown's announcement, was not there in any documented sense alongside the comet's nucleus. SAO 141894 was there. The star moved through the field in its own independent trajectory, as fixed stars appear to do when viewed from a moving platform, and its presence in photographs continued to be explicable in the same terms professional astronomers had offered from the beginning. The explanation was correct. The companion story was the result of an outdated chart, an ambiguous photograph, a radio program, and a sequence of unverified claims that had traveled faster than the corrections assembled to address them. Applewhite knew of the explanations. The group's engagement with internet discussions meant the mainstream astronomical account was available to them, as it was available to anyone with a browser and a phone line in early 1997. The existence of the counter-argument was not a secret and was not hidden from the membership. The interpretation the group placed on the companion claim was not the result of ignorance of the rebuttal. It was, from the group's theological perspective, the result of a different framework for evaluating what counted as credible evidence. The official astronomical community's dismissal of the companion was, within that framework, consistent with the pattern of official dismissal that the group understood to apply to all next-level phenomena. The correction did not reach them as correction. It reached them as an expected response. The Heavensgate.com statements from this period are specific and available. The language describes the comet's passage in terms that the group had developed across more than 2 decades of doctrinal work. The spacecraft accompanying Hale-Bopp is described not as a possibility or a hope, but as a reality, assessed through the interpretive framework the theology provided. The departure is described in the same practical and informational register that the group used for everything else. The anticipated transfer from human vehicle to next-level existence is placed in the context of the group's accumulated understanding of how such transfers worked. The body left behind, the soul received, the next stage of the journey begun. There is a particular quality to documents that were written to be read after the events they anticipated. The Heavensgate.com statements were public before the group's departure, but they were also clearly written with the post-departure reader in mind, the person who would arrive at the page after the news had broken and want to understand what had happened. They are, in that sense, addressed to a future that the group was confident would arrive. The pages are thorough. The explanations are detailed. The tone is that of people who want to be understood accurately, who are aware that they will be interpreted by audiences without their theological framework, and who have chosen to make the fullest possible record of their reasoning and their intention before that interpretation begins. The cassettes in their labeled cases represent a different kind of document. They are personal in a way the website is not. Individual voices, individual faces, individual statements made by people sitting in a room in front of a camera and choosing their words. The cases are plain. The handwriting on the labels is neat. The addresses on the packages are written with care. These are the last practical tasks performed by the members who performed them, and they were performed with the attention to detail that characterized everything the group did. The higher source websites, the doctrinal materials, the communal schedule, the organization of the house. The packages sat in the house, prepared and addressed and waiting. The comet was visible outside on those clear March evenings, steady in the northwest sky above the California hills, its dual tails tracing a pale fan that widened as the nucleus descended toward its closest approach. The ion tail extended nearly straight from the nucleus in the direction away from the sun. a pure blue-white, the color of charged gas driven outward by solar wind, the color of a process so ancient and mechanical that it predated any witness by millions of years. The dust tail curved away at a slightly different angle, broader and warmer, a yellow-white reflection of sunlight bouncing off the particles the comet shed continuously as it moved. Both tails were visible to the unassisted eye from most locations across the northern hemisphere. Whoever stood at a window in the Rancho Santa Fe house on those evenings and looked northwest would have seen a comet. The companion was not there beside it, in any sense the records support. The comet was the largest and brightest object of its kind in a generation, and it was traveling through the inner solar system on a trajectory that had been calculated precisely, and its closest approach to Earth had been known in advance and could be predicted to the day. The date existed before Applewhite attached meaning to it. The comet's path through the sky existed before any human being interpreted what it carried alongside it. The packages were eventually mailed. The cassettes reached the people and organizations they were addressed to. Rio D'Angelo received his copies. The media organizations received theirs. The website remained up. The statements remained on it. The comet continued its transit across the spring sky, indifferent to the interpretations it had collected, moving along its altered orbital path toward the outer solar system and the long cold of the passage ahead. The packaged videotapes sat ready for mailing in the quiet of the Rancho Santa Fe house. Plain cases, neat labels, addressed and set aside in the orderly way the group managed every practical task. Every detail attended to with the same care that had characterized the group's communal life across the years that preceded this final preparation, waiting in the specific calm of objects whose purpose has been fulfilled in advance, needing only the ordinary passage of time for the rest to follow. The street in Rancho Santa Fe was quiet on an ordinary California afternoon. The house sat back from the road in the particular way that large, well-maintained houses do in upscale residential neighborhoods, set behind a low border of cultivated shrubs, the exterior walls pale and clean in the coastal light, the roof line slightly softened by the kind of afternoon sky that arrives off the Pacific with no drama, only a diffuse and gentle brightness that lies across everything at an equal depth. A car might have passed, a neighbor might have walked a dog along the sidewalk at the far end of the block. Nothing about the exterior of the house distinguished it from the houses on either side of it, or from any of the other houses on any of the other streets in the neighborhood that afternoon. The lawn was tended. The windows were clean. The address was an ordinary sequence of numbers on an ordinary street. Inside, 39 people were living together in carefully ordered rooms. The house the group had rented was large by most standards, a mansion in the ordinary sense of the word, meaning a structure built for space and for the performance of a certain kind of private comfort, with rooms that connected to other rooms in an architecture designed for a single wealthy family rather than for a community of 39 adults sharing domestic labor in close quarters. The group had adapted it. The rooms held multiple occupants. The communal spaces, kitchens, common areas, workrooms were organized with the same attention to function and order that characterized everything the group built and maintained. From their physical surroundings, to their doctrinal materials, to the website they had designed and continued to update with care. The house was referred to, informally, as the craft, not as a home, not as a commune. The craft, which was a word that carried within it the group's entire understanding of what the structure was for, not a permanent dwelling, but a vehicle of a particular kind, a container occupied for a specific duration in preparation for a transition the members understood to be imminent and certain. The neighborhood around them went about its day without particular awareness of what the house contained. Heaven's Gate had arrived in Rancho Santa Fe by a route that had taken more than 2 decades. The group had passed through rented spaces across the American West and Southwest, through communal arrangements in tents and vehicles and shared houses. Through years of deliberate separation from the ordinary world they had been taught to understand as a temporary and ultimately illusory condition, a phase of existence through which the soul moved on its way towards something organized, real, and located elsewhere in the universe. By the time they settled into the Rancho Santa Fe mansion, the community had contracted from its earlier, larger incarnations. The wandering period was over. What remained was a group of people who had been living together in various configurations for years, who knew each other's habits and rhythms, and who organized their shared existence according to a set of standards that governed nearly every aspect of daily life, from what they ate to what they wore to how they moved through the rooms of the house in pairs. The pairing was deliberate and precise. Each member was assigned a check partner, one specific person with whom they moved through the activities of each day. A pairing designed not for companionship in the ordinary sense, but for accountability, for the mutual reinforcement of the behavioral standards the group maintained. The check partner system meant that no member of the group was ever truly alone, that every activity from work to meals to sleep occurred within a structure of mutual observation that was understood not as surveillance, but as care, as the kind of careful attention that a community committed to collective behavioral discipline required in order to sustain that discipline without a hierarchy of constant oversight. Applewhite had established the standard. The check partner system maintained it, pair by pair, room by room, throughout every day the group spent inside that house. The clothes were identical in their logic, if not always in their precise details, loose-fitting, functional, gender-neutral in their cut and their effect. The hair on every head in the house was short, trimmed to the same approximate length on every person so that the group's gender-neutral appearance was visible as a consistent and deliberate physical fact, not a coincidence of individual taste, not a shared fashion, but the visible expression of a belief. The group taught that next-level beings had transcended biological sex entirely, that gender was a mammalian characteristic attached to the temporary vehicle of the human body rather than to the self that inhabited it, and that the process of preparation for next-level existence required the gradual elimination of everything the body carried that was specific to its mammalian nature. The identical haircuts, the loose and undifferentiating clothes, were part of that preparation. They were visible in every room of the house, a quiet and consistent feature of life inside it. Several male members had gone further than clothing and hair. Applewhite himself was among those who had chosen surgical castration as a means of fully committing to the celibate standard the group maintained, a decision the group did not describe in distress terms, but as a natural and even practical extension of the commitment they had already made to suppress what they called human mammalian behaviors. The list of behaviors they worked to suppress was precise and specific: sexuality, romantic attachment, family bonds, personal ambition, individual ego, all of the characteristics that in the group's theological framework kept the soul tethered to its temporary human vehicle rather than moving toward the level of existence the members understood to be their actual destination. Celibacy was not an imposition on the group. It was a condition they had chosen, and in many cases a condition they had maintained for years, and the check partner system existed in part to support that maintenance through the ordinary friction of daily life. The house was not an austere place in the ordinary sense. It had the quality of careful functionality rather than deliberate severity. Rooms arranged to serve their purposes, objects kept because they were useful, communal spaces organized for the work the group was doing rather than for comfort or self-expression. There were computers, several of them arranged on plain desks in what served as the group's web design workspace, the cables tidied and routed with the same attention to order that characterized the rest of the house. The screens showed in the period-appropriate interfaces of the late 1990s, the kind of work that a small web development company would produce for its clients. Pages in progress, code and text editors, the visual grammar of early professional web design that has since become its own kind of historical artifact. The business was called Higher Source. It operated as a genuine commercial enterprise, offering web design and maintenance services to clients in the San Diego area. And most of those clients had no particular awareness that the company developing and maintaining their websites was staffed entirely by members of a communal religious group living together in a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe. The work was professional. The group approached it with the same focused attention they brought to their doctrinal materials and their communal responsibilities. Higher Source provided the income that funded the group's way of living, the rent, the food, the equipment, the substantial resources required to maintain the web presence the group had built for itself and continued to develop throughout the mid-1990s as the internet became the primary medium through which they communicated their beliefs to the world outside. The website was heavensgate.com. It had been built with the same technical care the group applied to its client work, and it housed a quantity of doctrinal material, statements, recordings, transcribed teachings, the accumulated theological framework of more than 20 years, organized and accessible through a plain and functional navigation that prioritized legibility and completeness over visual elaboration. The group understood the internet not as a novelty, but as a tool appropriate to their moment, a medium through which the next level's message could be distributed beyond the physical limits of their location to anyone in the world who arrived at the address. The site was updated, the statements were current, the group's communal presence online had a specificity and an organizational logic that mirrored the specificity and organizational logic of the house they lived in. In the evenings, the group watched television. Star Trek was permitted and watched with a particular quality of attention that distinguished it from ordinary entertainment. Applewhite had incorporated the franchise into his teaching, not as entertainment, but as evidence, as a cultural artifact through which human intuition about the reality of extraterrestrial life expressed itself in the only form available to a civilization not yet ready to receive direct confirmation. The starships, the crew compositions, the episodes in which human characters encountered beings of radically different physiological and cognitive organization, all of it was understood by the group as the unconscious expression of truths the broader human culture was not yet equipped to recognize as literal. Applewhite cited such programs in his recorded teachings with the earnest seriousness of a scholar identifying primary sources. The television in the communal space was not a distraction from the group's beliefs. It was, in the evening hours of the house in Rancho Santa Fe, a kind of confirmation of them. The book sat on a plain shelf in the group's workspace. It was called How and When Heaven's Gate May Be Entered, and it had been assembled and published by the group itself, a volume of dense, carefully typeset doctrinal material representing decades of accumulated theological development, organized for distribution to whoever might receive it. The spine showed no cracking, from the kind of handling that suggests repeated consultation. The book had the quality of a document prepared for posterity as much as for immediate use, a complete record of what the group believed and why they believed it, left in a form that would survive their departure from the house and continue to speak after they had gone. The group had thought carefully about the permanence of their materials. They had thought carefully about what they were leaving behind. The question of what a community leaves behind when it departs a place is not, in itself, an unusual historical question. Houses retain the arrangements their occupants made. Objects remain on shelves in the order the people who placed them there preferred. The particular kind of attention a group brought to its surroundings persists in the organization of the things they organized, in the tidied cables, the labeled cassettes, the bookshelves arranged by the logic of their contents rather than by chance. The group in the Rancho Santa Fe mansion had been attentive to order throughout their communal life. That attentiveness was present in the house when the police arrived to find them in March 1997, and it was visible in every documented account of what the interior of the mansion looked like: orderly, spare, calm, each person in their assigned space, the house arranged around them with the same care it had always been arranged. The group's members came from ordinary American lives. They had been students and teachers, nurses and accountants, mechanics and musicians. They had had families. They had had jobs and addresses and ordinary daily routines before they joined the group, some of them in the 1970s, and some of them more recently, arriving by different routes and at different times to the same communal framework and the same shared set of beliefs. The specific circumstances by which each person had come to be living in that house in Rancho Santa Fe were various. The outcome, 39 people in a large rented house, working together, eating together, sleeping in paired rooms, watching Star Trek in the evenings, was singular and shared. Some of them had been with Applewhite since the mid-1970s, since the meetings in rented community halls in the Pacific Northwest, since the early years of wandering across the American West, when the group was still working out the vocabulary of its beliefs and the structure of its communal life. Those long-term members had lived through the full arc of the group's development, through multiple name changes, through the death of Bonnie Nettles from cancer in 1985, through the years of communal life that had moved the group progressively away from public outreach and inward toward the close maintenance of the community itself. They had seen the group contract and had stayed through the contraction. They knew the teachings as intimately as any text can be known after decades of immersion, and they had organized their lives around them in a way that was, by any observable measure, complete. Others were newer. They had found the group through its website, through materials distributed in the mid-1990s, as the internet opened a new channel of access to organizations that would previously have been encountered only through word of mouth or physical presence. The internet had allowed Heaven's Gate to reach people it would not otherwise have reached, and some of those people had read the materials online and recognized in them something they understood as true, and had made the decision to leave their existing lives and join the group in Rancho Santa Fe. The speed at which such a decision could be made in the mid-1990s was different from the speed at which it could have been made a decade earlier. The website was always available. The materials were complete and organized. A person sitting alone with a computer in any American city could read through the entire doctrinal framework of Heaven's Gate in a single night, if they chose to, and some of them did, and some of those people sent messages to the address listed on the site, and some of those messages were the beginning of a process that ended with them inside the house. The daily rhythm of the house had a regularity that its members experienced, by all available accounts, as settled and purposeful. The work of Higher Source occupied a portion of each day. Communal meals were shared. Doctrinal study and the review of recorded teachings were part of the routine. The check partner system structured the hours not organized around specific activities, ensuring that the communal framework was present in even the unscheduled moments between tasks. The group did not describe this density of structure as constraining. In the vocabulary they used to explain their lives to themselves and to the world, it was preparatory, a means of organizing the human vehicle and the habits of its occupant in ways that made the transition to next-level existence more complete and more possible. The cassette tapes were labeled in the same neat handwriting that appeared on every other labeled object in the house. The group had produced a significant quantity of recorded material over the years. Applewhite's teaching sessions, recorded as part of the Beyond Human series and other productions, alongside materials the group produced for internal use and for distribution to former members and to media organizations. The tapes in the house were organized on shelves in a simple media cabinet, the kind of organizational system that a small office or educational institution might maintain. The labels visible and consistently formatted, the collection complete and accessible. The recording equipment used to produce them was professional enough to produce results the group considered suitable for distribution, not broadcast quality by the standards of commercial television, but clear and coherent and sufficient to carry the teachings across to whoever received them. Some of the tapes had been packaged and addressed in the days before the group's departure. They had been prepared for mailing to Rio D'Angelo, a former member who had left the group but maintained contact, and to media organizations the group had selected. The packages were addressed. The return address on each package would have been the Rancho Santa Fe Mansion, a last known location, a point of origin for materials that would arrive after the senders were no longer there to be reached at that address. The group had thought through the logistics of what they were leaving behind, with the same care they applied to the organization of their doctrinal materials and the maintenance of their website. The tapes were part of a record. They understood themselves as leaving a record. The neighbors on the surrounding streets had no particular reason to notice anything unusual about the house, a large property occupied by a group of adults who maintained it carefully, who worked from home, who kept quiet hours, and produced no visible disruption. There was nothing in the exterior presentation of the house or the behavior of its occupants that would have drawn particular attention in an upscale residential neighborhood in San Diego County. The group moved through the neighborhood without making a mark on it. They bought groceries. They drove ordinary vehicles. The surface of their daily life, visible from the street or encountered in brief exchanges, was unremarkable. The remarkableness was interior. It was present in the specific vocabulary the group used to describe their bodies and themselves. It was present in the paired movement through the rooms of the house, in the identical haircuts, in the careful gender-neutral uniformity of the clothing. It was present in the way the New Testament sat on the plain table, with careful annotations in its margins, or in the way the Star Trek episodes played in the communal space with the particular focused attention of a group finding confirmation rather than entertainment. It was present in the website that had been built and maintained with professional care to carry the group's teachings to whoever sought them. The remarkableness was everywhere inside the house and visible in none of it from outside. There is a kind of historical attention that belongs specifically to interiors, not to the events that occurred in them or to the significance that retrospective understanding attaches to them, but to the texture of daily existence in a specific place, the arrangement of objects, the rhythm of shared meals, the sound of work being done in rooms designed for other purposes. That attention belongs here. The house in Rancho Santa Fe was for the people who lived in it, a home in the functional sense of the word, a place where they slept and ate and worked and watched television in the evenings, where they knew the arrangement of every room and the identity of every person they passed in the corridor, where the daily structure of their communal life had accumulated over months into the particular familiarity of a place that has been lived in long enough to become ordinary. The group's self-published book, sitting on its plain shelf with its dense and carefully typeset pages, held within it the entire architecture of a belief system developed over more than 2 decades. The doctrinal vocabulary, the theological framework, the cosmological map that organized the universe into levels of existence through which souls moved toward graduation. The book had been assembled and published with the intention of permanence. It was meant to outlast its authors. It was meant to remain readable and complete after the group had gone, in the same way that the website was meant to remain accessible and complete, in the same way that the videotapes were meant to arrive at their addresses and be played back by whoever received them. The group was not attempting to disappear. They were attempting to leave a record that was organized and whole and findable by anyone who looked. The website remained online after March 1997. It is still online. Heaven's Gate.com loads on a current browser with the same plain text formatting it carried in the late 1990s, the same simple navigation, the same complete archive of doctrinal materials the group assembled over the years of their existence. The appearance of the page on a current browser is an encounter across decades, the visual grammar of early web design rendered in a contemporary browser window, the formatting conventions of 1997, sitting unchanged on a server somewhere in the ordinary infrastructure of the internet, available to anyone who arrives at the address. The URL resolves, the page loads, the text is exactly as the group arranged it. That persistence is worth sitting with for a moment. The group understood their website as a final statement, a complete record of what they believed, organized for whoever came after them to find. They built it with care, they maintained it with care, and it exists still in precisely the form they left it, not because anyone has continued to maintain it out of ongoing belief, but because the structure the group built was solid enough to survive the passage of time without requiring tending. The texts they wrote are there. The teachings Applewhite recorded and transcribed are there. The statements they prepared in the final months of their communal life are there, readable in full, in the same order and arrangement the group decided upon. The archive is open, the book on the plain shelf, the organized cassette tapes, the website loading on a current browser. These are not relics in the conventional sense, objects preserved under glass and labeled with the dates of their significance. They are working materials that the group left in working condition, designed to continue functioning as the record they were always meant to be. The group did not hide their beliefs. They published them in as many forms as they had access to: print, videotape, broadcast, and then when the internet opened as a medium, online, in a form that the passing years have left essentially unchanged. The communal life in the Rancho Santa Fe mansion had the quality of a long preparation arriving at its expected end. The group had been moving toward this specific moment for more than 2 decades, had been organizing their beliefs, refining their practices, structuring their communal life, in preparation for a departure they understood as certain and scheduled. The check partner system, the identical clothing, the careful suppression of mammalian behaviors, the web design work that funded the community, the website that held the community's teachings, the cassette tapes prepared and packaged for mailing, all of it was preparation. All of it had been maintained with the kind of care that people bring to work that matters to them, that they understand to have a purpose beyond its immediate execution. The street in Rancho Santa Fe was quiet again. In the days after March 1997, the house sat where it had always sat, behind its cultivated shrubs, under the diffuse coastal light that arrived off the Pacific with no drama. The neighbors went about their ordinary routines. The work of higher source was no longer being done in the rooms where it had been done. The cassette tapes had been mailed. The website remained at its address, unchanged, its navigation unchanged, its archive unchanged, continuing to hold every word and recording the group had placed there with the intention that it should last. What the group left behind is still present in the forms they left it. The texts are readable. The recordings exist. The doctrinal materials assembled over 20 years are organized and complete and findable by anyone who looks for them at the address the group chose and maintained. The house itself passed to other occupants. The house is due. The specific arrangements of rooms that had held the check partner, pairs, and the identical clothing, and the evening Star Trek viewings, dissolving back into the ordinary residential function of a large house in an upscale neighborhood in San Diego County. The walls repainted, the rooms rearranged, the specificity of communal life that had once organized every interior surface absorbed gradually back into the neutral anonymity of an empty building waiting for new use. The book, wherever it now rests, still holds the same text. The website, at the same address the group chose for it, still holds the same text. The record the group built is still the record the group built, not diminished by time, not expanded by interpretation, not altered by the distance between 1997 and now. It exists in the form it was given, that waits in the form it was given. And